To talk about the crisis in South Sudan, we have George Musamali, who is a security analyst and of the Executive Protection Services. It is a Nairobi-based security consultancy firm. And in London, we have Ayo Johnson, editor of Viewpoint Africa. And here in Beijing, we have Ms. He Wenping, who is a research fellow at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to our program. First of all, what do you think exactly is happening inside South Sudan? Ms. Musamali, is it ethnic conflict or is it just political rivalries?
This initially started off as a political spite between the two main contenders. This is Salva Kiir, the president of Southern Sudan, and his former deputy, Dr. Riek Machar. And it has now changed its face, and now it's becoming a duel between two tribes. These are the Nuer of Dr. Riek Machar and the Dinkas of Salva Kiir. So we are seeing the Nuer complaining that the government of Salva Kiir has excluded them from governance. And Salva Kiir is also claiming that Riek Machar had organized a coup. So what we are seeing is that it has turned into ethnicity, and people are being killed depending on which tribe you come from.
Right.
And the smaller tribes have now joined Riek Machar, and they're fighting the Dinkas.
Mr. Johnson, if it is already evolving into an ethnic conflict, then what does it mean for the country?
I think it sends the wrong signals all around. A newly developed country in 2011, a lot of hope and a lot of promise. But what we're seeing is that South Sudan, besides the fact that it has nearly 200 or so different tribal groups, were unified. Unified when they were fighting a common enemy in North Sudan. And now that that enemy is no more, now that both countries are meant to be at peace, ultimately what we're seeing is that the different tribes are now turning on each other, seeing their individual differences. I think it's a lack of political will, it's a lack of governance, and a lack of leadership structure from both parties. And ultimately, I believe that because South Sudan is so young, it doesn't have the structural capabilities to develop and evolve, and somehow it's being caught out by individual petty squabbling, which is hijacking the entire democratic process. And ultimately, we're looking at a potential civil war.
Is a potential civil war really imminent? Ms. He.
It is a danger for that terrible intention. I think the country, because the country is so young and it takes time to to establish a national identity. As we have already known, there are more than 200 different ethnic groups in this country. And now this time around, it's very sad to see this confrontation between different political leaders, and then quickly moved from the first stage between those fighting between different candidates, and then those military also has been divided behind them, and then quickly developed the second stage, that is the rivalry of those different ethnic groups. So which means very clearly this country takes time to establish a national identity. That is not easy for a young country.
And what can others do? At this moment, we understand, Ms. He, the African Union, the United Nations, together with the United States, have all voiced their opinions to let the two different sides, the rivals, to talk to one another. They might be talking to one another in the future. However, the ethnic conflict might be still going on, which means these politicians might not be that relevant eventually. So what can others do? Ms. He, very briefly.
Yeah, I think international society will do a lot, especially those regional blocs. For example, now IGAD, that is Intergovernmental Authority of Development, they have already taken the move. So they sent the foreign ministers in this country trying to block a deal between those different parties.
Mr. Musamali, do you agree with that? What can others do? Do others really play a crucial role? Actually, the two parts have to fight it out eventually?
I think eventually we need to bring in the international community because we've seen these kind of conflicts elsewhere in Africa. And if we let it continue the way things are happening right now, all the other small tribes are going to gang up against the Dinka. And you will realize that the newest democratic country in Africa is going to go to the dogs. So it's high time the international community came in very quickly to avert a crisis. And remember, there are claims that the Dinka are fighting because they feel like Dr. Machar and his group were collaborators, because at one point, Dr. Riek Machar was actually collaborated with the North and was fighting the Dinka when they were fighting for independence. So this is an issue where we need to bring in international community. We've already seen the African Union taking action. We've seen IGAD coming in. And I think this is the way to go. If we let it go beyond the way it is right now, we are going to have a lot of lives that will be lost.
Mr. Johnson, can the international community really play a big role? Can things really be settled down as a result of direct efforts from the quote-unquote international community?
Yes, the international community have played a role previously. We saw when we had North and South Sudan with a civil war that went on for many, many years. We saw the international community come up with a plan of action to see both countries split. Ultimately, a new plan is required. I think there's a new energy required from the international community and ultimately key stakeholders. And I believe the Chinese government also has leverage because of its influence, and I'm sure it will play a pivotal role. But ultimately, the wider international community would also have to try to ask the two parties, Mr. Machar and Mr. Salva Kiir, to come to the negotiating table. This can only be addressed through peaceful means. One thing is when you start fighting, when it becomes a civil strife, when ultimately sectarian violence becomes the day of rule of the day, then ultimately it can't be stopped. It takes a long, long time, and ultimately it goes out of control. So that's
right.
the worry, really.
We are seeing, Mr. Johnson, rather, this is at the very first stage, some would argue, of a civil war. Mainly you have two sides clearly defining their own territories and trying to fight one another. However, some would say even though the negotiation could go on between the two rivalries, the civil war could still break out. The civil war can go on at the same time when the negotiations are being done. So we see that in many countries happening in a similar situation. Mr. Johnson, can once again the negotiations and international intervention really play a role, or rather we have to let this young republic to fight out their own way to seek democracy, fight out their own way to have their own government? Mr. Johnson.
I think deep down there's a limit to what the international community can do. Ultimately, it's down to the South Sudanese. They have got to want to have peace. Their leaders have got to show leadership. Above and beyond all, they do know that they've been through conflict before. They understand it takes them nowhere, and there are very little few winners, and ultimately their people suffer. Already, the international community, some elements of the international community, including the United States, are already threatening with drawing back aid, which is crucially required for a very poor country like South Sudan. So I think international pressure on the governance structures, international pressure on the leadership structures would hopefully bring them to the negotiating table, and ultimately we may have a peace deal that can be reached.
Ms. He, we see the international community, particularly some of the crucial players, such as the United States, such as China, have already been acting, not only urging negotiations, but particularly trying to evacuate their citizens inside the country as a result of the crisis in that specific South Sudan. However, American soldiers have already been injured as a result of some evacuation process. Meanwhile, Chinese nationals are also worried about their counterparts inside the South Sudan. So can and should the government now in South Sudan guarantee the security of foreign nationals inside that country?
Of course, there's no question about that. The Sudanese government, South Sudan government, should guarantee the foreigners' safety, and also should offer some access for those evacuation.
But is it happening?
Yeah, but I don't think they have this capacity right now, because now the fighting between different groups has been becoming quite fierce, and also even some town has been now in the control of those the former deputy president Mashar's army, the support of army. So it's not easy. And actually, recently I heard even some foreigners, they have been killed, civilian foreigners.
Right.
For example, Kenyans and Ugandas. So now this bad conflict has been already spilled over to the neighboring countries. Now the Uganda sent the troops in, and also Kenya now send the troops in as well. So at the first stage, they are saying their purpose is trying to evacuate their citizens. But of course, they also can play another role. That is maybe to create some buffer zone between those different fighting groups. But eventually, I think this negotiation process now, unfortunately, is moving into a very uncertain future. It's, it's not so optimistic at all, because the Marshal, the deputy the president of Marshal, he has already said clear he doesn't want to join any negotiation except this President Kiir stepped down. So maybe people are talking about other options, maybe which is maybe this deputy president Marshal can be allowed to establish another party, because now they are fighting for this presidency within the same party that says SPLM, South Sudan People's Liberation Movement. So I think maybe other options also should be discussed.
There are different options on the table politically, but what we are seeing is devastating situation inside that country. Mr. Musamani, we understand that country, South Sudan, is actually the third largest, has the third largest oil reserves inside sub-Saharan area, right after Nigeria and Angola. And many countries, including China, including India, all have investments in the oil production there. So eventually, if conflicts continue, what does it mean for the country's economy? And what does it mean for the investment opportunities and even confidence about foreign investors inside South Sudan, and therefore for its country, for its future?
I think what has happened is actually very unfortunate, bearing in mind that so many countries have invested in Southern Sudan. Remember, 95% of the economy of South Sudan relies on oil. And already Kenya has done some investments. They are already building a railway line from Lamu to Juba. And they were expecting to cash in on this. So far, we had so many citizens from Kenya that had crossed over to Southern Sudan, and they were doing business there, including banks that had opened branches there. And Ugandans are also in this. But you see that when this has happened, it actually eroded the confidence that people had in the government of Southern Sudan. And it's going to impact negatively on the economies of these countries, bearing in mind also the insecurity that is going to come out of this. Remember, we have so many small arms that are circulating within the region, and this new crisis is also going to add fuel on that, because small arms will start now moving out of Southern Sudan and getting into the other economies. And definitely this is going to affect us at a very, very big rate.
Mr. Johnson, meantime, we all understand that South Sudan and Sudan itself still have been, over the past 2 years, in conflict in terms of how to define some of specific areas of the borders between the two countries after 2 years of independence of South Sudan. Will all of these entangle together, and what does it mean for South Sudan's future, politically particularly?
I think politically it puts it in a very sticky mess. Ultimately, it's going to be very difficult for the North to accept currently that they're not going to be having oil revenues which are more than likely to stop, which took a while to start again after they previously had stopped many months ago. And also it's going to be very difficult when you have rebels through Mr. Machar supportive structures who will now control some of the oil fields. So it's going to be very difficult for the political through North and South. Between South and South, which is internally, politically, I think the country is split, the parliament is split, the political SPLM is split through ethnical lines, and I do not believe that they will be able to see eye to eye in the medium to short term. I think even if we accept negotiations through the political process, through international pressure, ultimately the leaders who need to show leadership, who are not showing currently, have to pay the ultimate price. And it would appear that war, which is about to ensue, which has started now, knows no bounds in terms of how long it will take, when it's likely to stop, and how many people are going to be displaced, not to mention those who would lose their lives.
At this moment, as we mentioned earlier, there has been attack against the UN peacekeepers base inside South Sudan. There has been condemnation from the international community against that. Meanwhile, African Union, together with some specific countries, together with the United States, sending in different numbers of troops inside that country for intervention. But, Ms. He, whenever there is outside intervention in a country that is politically unstable, there's always the possibility that others are playing a role inside that country that might go against the eventual interest of that specific country. We saw that in many cases. What is the situation right now in South Sudan, and where do you think things are going from here?
Well, as you rightly said, now even the UN peacekeepers now has been getting involved in this civil conflict in South Sudan. Now, for around 3 Indian peacekeepers has been already killed, and then the the United States aircraft has been attacked as well. So, which means even those outside intervention forces right now, they couldn't play their job in a very suitable way. Because a lot of refugees now, they are all flooded into the UN compound. They want to get protection from those UN forces. But you know, all those like Nur and the Dinka, those youth, angry youth, they even want to get into this UN compound to kill the other group, ethnic group. So those situations now becoming more complicated when the outside forces has been get involved in. So I don't think at the moment there is the need to say send more UN troops in that area, which means that situation cannot be moving into a right direction rather than make it more complicated.
Mr. Musamali, your final words, very briefly if you can.
I think the international community needs to come in very quickly, bearing in mind that what we are seeing in Southern Sudan is exactly what happened in Somalia, where the military split and the loyalties changed. The same picture is coming out of Southern Sudan, where we have a few people in the military that have defected and have joined Dr. Riek Machar in this fight. So we are seeing a situation whereby if the international community does not come in, we are going to see a lot of bloodshed in Southern Sudan.
Mr. Johnson, very briefly, if you can.
Well, I think it's sad, it's depressing. It's a reflection of the fact that the peace deal that we had in 2004 was not a success, clearly. We did not disarm, we did not have the country heal itself through a rehabilitation of some description, and ultimately what we're seeing is the blowback of that failed process.
Ayu Johnson, He Wenping, and George Musamali, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. And we have got plenty more ahead here on World Insight, including a discussion on the latest source of tension between China and the United States. So stay tuned.
Still to come, troubled waters. A near miss between Chinese and U.S. naval vessels signals further tensions in the South China Sea. A brighter future. The Fed cuts back on stimulus, raising hopes for the U.S. economy in 2014. And 1 year on. This time last year, a gang rape in the Indian capital shocked the world.